Hello, this is Tony Hiller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. This video is titled The Great Flood Myth. Just about every culture has a great flood myth. In the Christian Judeo myth, a giant flood came to cleanse the earth of man's sins. Climate alarmists believe the same thing, that man's carbon sins are going to lead to great floods and that they're already happening. A good example is the current flooding in the Midwest. Climate change's footprints are on U.S. Midwest floods. Scientists. Climate change played a hand in the deadly floods in the U.S. upper Midwest that have damaged crops and drowned livestock, scientists said on Thursday. Man-made greenhouse gases trap heat in the atmosphere, warming the oceans, making the air above them more humid, scientists say. When a storm picks up and eventually spits out that moisture, it can be devastating for people caught below. So they have this group of scientists who are blaming flooding in the Midwest on man's carbon sins. These people are the new prophets. And they have a picture to prove it. Flooded areas are seen near Nebraska City, Nebraska, U.S., March 20, 2019. So let's see if what these scientists are saying actually makes any sense. This is a graph of February-March temperatures in Nebraska going back to 1895. This year has been the third coldest on record. That doesn't sound a lot like a global warming problem. Scientists have known for hundreds of years that cold air can't hold much moisture. That's why the cold air gets saturated and dumps out lots of rain. And sea surface temperatures west of the United States are generally below normal. In the southern hemisphere, a very large percentage of the oceans are below normal temperature at their surface. The storm systems coming into the U.S. from the west have generally been coming across water which is below normal temperature, and the air in the Midwest has been extremely cold. This story is not at all consistent with the story which the scientists' prophets have been telling the press. The United States also had terrible flooding in March of 1936. March 20, 1936. All Eastern America under floodwaters. President signs appeal as capital flooded. 100 cities and 14 states affected. This was downtown Pittsburgh on March 20th, 1936. My grandfather was at a business meeting there and had to be evacuated by boat. February of that year was the coldest February on record in the United States. Winter-spring flooding in the United States is almost always associated with cold, not warmth. Warm springs tend to be dominated by high pressure and they're dry. These scientist prophets being quoted about the Nebraska floods have no clue what they're talking about. This is what Wheeling, West Virginia looked like on March 20th, 1936. Now let's go back to Nebraska in 1935. 250 thought dead in Nebraska flood. Nebraska has worst flood in history. That Memorial Day flood was associated with a storm system which produced world's record rainfall in Texas. Woodward Ranch, Texas received 22 inches of rain in less than 3 hours on May 31st, 1935. And that came just a few hours after record rainfall in Colorado, which dropped almost 23 inches of rain in 4 hours. That rain flowed down into Nebraska and killed hundreds of people. Carbon dioxide was below 310 parts per million at the time. Nebraska's had lots of floods. Here's one from 1940. Here's one from 1941. Another one from 1947. Another one from 1950. 1951. 1962. 1963. 1978. Now let's move on to Illinois. This was an article this week from the Chicago Tribune. Climate change has already started disrupting life in the Great Lakes region, and it's only going to get worse. Wow, more climate prophets. These people believe they can see the future, and they have a picture to prove it, flooding on the Rock River in Illinois. Had these Chicago Tribune writers done any actual research and read their own paper, they would have known that floods on the Rock River occur all the time. Chicago Tribune, 30 March 1929. 2 workmen drowned in Rock River flood. Rock River flooding in 1937. 1948. 1952. 3 floods in 1952. 1965. 1969. 1973. 1979. The flood of the century. 1993. 1997. Floods on the Rock River happen all the time. at least once every 10 years. Floods on the Rock River are an indication that the climate is not changing. If the flood stopped, that would be an indication of climate change. The Chicago Tribune writer has it exactly backwards. Let's look at some other flooding from the 1920s and 1930s. 1927 brought the worst floods in U.S. history to the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River was flooded for more than 6 months in 1927, and hundreds of thousands of descendants of slaves who had homesteaded along the Mississippi were forced to flee and move to northern cities. This was a typical scene along the Mississippi and Louisiana that year. And 1927 also brought the worst floods in Vermont history. More than 1,000 bridges washed out along the Winooski River that year, and the lieutenant governor drowned in the 1927 flood. I used to ride my bike across the Winooski River on the way to work and could see the high water mark from that flood. It was pretty incredible. 1931 brought the worst floods in history to China. More than 3 million people died and tens of millions of people were left homeless. I already mentioned the floods of 1936. Flood sweeps into Ohio Valley. Death and destruction mount. Flood toll more than 100. A year later, the worst floods in history hit the Ohio River Valley. Here are some pictures from the 1937 flood. The water was 85 feet deep. This doesn't look like a very amusing day at the amusement park. And it's also not very amusing how children are being lied to and used for propaganda. Children are innocent and don't know much about history, particularly because their schools don't teach them about history. They have no way of knowing whether these floods occurred in the past and will believe anything their teachers tell them. And then we have groups like the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists encouraging children to turn against their parents. Adults won't take climate change seriously, so we the youth are forced to strike. So the message here is that climate change is going to kill these children when they get older, and their parents are doing nothing to stop it. This makes their parents the enemy. It's difficult to imagine anything much more evil than a group of people lying to children to get them to turn against their parents. There's nothing new about this, though. Every great movement of evil has used children for propaganda, lied to them, and used them to pressure their parents. Hitler Youth was a good example. The same thing was done in just about every communist revolution. This next video is going to shock you. It was put out by the global warming alarmist group 1010, and it shows a school teacher actually killing her children who don't believe her stories about catastrophic climate change.
Right, kids, just before you go, there's a brilliant idea in the air that I'd like to run by you. Now, it's called 1010. The idea is everyone starts cutting their carbon emissions by 10%. Thus, keeping the planet safe for everyone, eventually. Now, this hasn't got to be a huge thing, but I would love it if you and your families would think about doing something.
What sort of thing, miss?
Well, like getting your dad to insulate the loft, or taking your next holiday by train instead of flying, or buying energy-saving light bulbs.
We're thinking of using our car less. I'm going to cycle to school.
That's fantastic, Jemima. Now, no pressure at all, but it'd be great to get a sense of how many of you might do this. Just a rough percentage. That's fantastic! And those not? Philip and Tracy. That's fine, that's absolutely fine. Your own choice. Okay, class, thank you so much for today, and I will see you all tomorrow. Oh, just before you go, I just need to press this little button here. Now everybody, please remember to read chapters 5 and 6 on volcanoes and glaciation. Except for Philip and Tracy, of course.
The message I've been trying to get across in these past few videos is that the people behind the global warming scam are not good people. They're extremely evil. These are people who are willing to lie to children, frighten them, and turn them against their parents in order to achieve their political goals. And the reporters who are doing their dirty work are, of course, just useful idiots. This is not about saving cuddly polar bears. I'm traveling to Washington, D.C. later this week to help end this scam. It's very important that we all get involved and do whatever we can. And visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.